take a minute and think, what do you love about Judaism? Now, I realize that is a leading question, but given it is a Friday evening and surely there is something new just released on Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime, even if you don't have any of those services, there have been 20,000 hours of content uploaded to YouTube since this service began. That's true, by the way. The statistic is about 500 hours every minute. My point is, you have other options. There are other things you could be doing right now, and yet you are here having Shabbat with us. And so the question I ask is, why? What is it that you appreciate, that you like, that you love about Judaism that brings you here tonight? My second question, what is it that you like least about Judaism? That is a polite way of asking, what do you dislike about Judaism? I am curious which of those questions was the easier one to answer. But unfortunately, we can't have a conversation virtually in this environment, so let me offer the two most common answers that I have heard. And I will quote from two rabbis far more eloquent than me. The first, Rabbi Micah, speaking from this very bima 1 week ago, taught us that what distinguishes Judaism, what elevates and differentiates it from its biblical neighbors was the particular and universal God idea, the God of ethical monotheism, one God whose principal concern is the way we treat others. One God whose principal demand is moral and ethical behavior. Now, if that's not what came to your mind, if you had come up with, I don't know, potato latkes, that's okay. Sometimes that's my answer too. But most people, if given time to ponder that question, what do they love, what do they admire about Judaism, they will at some point conclude that they like Judaism and are drawn to it because of what we call Jewish values. And that is a difficult and perhaps impossible term to define, Jewish values. But I do think that what it means for most of us is a shorthand for the belief that what you do matters. Matters not because there might be a consequence, some sort of punishment or reward, but it matters because the God of Judaism tells us to do what is right and abstain from what is wrong, and that ought to be reason enough. What you do matters. On to that second question. What do you dislike about Judaism? Rabbi Bradley Artson distills perhaps the most common complaint by both Jews and non-Jews alike. It is the view that Judaism is obsessed with petty and restrictive rules that make Jewish life onerous and irrelevant. By focusing on endless regulations, Judaism misses the bigger picture. In other words, there are just too many rules. And to clarify, Rabbi Artson is naming the objection that Judaism is too legalistic, but that does not mean he is agreeing with it. Which brings us all to this week's Torah portion. Last week, we read the 10 Commandments. This week, we read the 53. That is a lot. Rabbi Artson uses the analogy of a parent. A young child might resent being subject to so many rules and limitations, but a parent knows those rules are necessary to guide and develop. In Rabbi Artson's view, these rules help create a meaningful life and a just society, and they are God's loving way of helping us to evolve into our best selves. The young child resents not being allowed to draw on the walls or the family dog, but one day, hopefully, that child will come to appreciate that she was taught that doing so would have been wrong. So too, we learn through these rules what is right and what is not. At the top of this list of 53 meets vote commandments in this week's Torah portion, the opening lines, we read the instruction that if you have a slave, after 6 years, you must set this person free. Such talk of slavery might make us uncomfortable, and it should. But the practice worked differently in the biblical world compared to more modern examples. As the commentator Rashi notes in his commentary to this week's Torah portion, a person becomes enslaved when he or she is unable to pay debts. When they have nothing else to offer, it is their labor that they sell. I do not mean to suggest slavery is a moral, ethical response to such a situation, but rather merely I want to point out that it is categorically different than what we think of when compared to slavery as practiced in this country historically. Nonetheless, a person in this situation, forced to sell their labor, their future labor, as an indentured servitude, such a person is extraordinarily vulnerable. Who among us, if we were destitute, if we were facing hunger, facing the threat of sleeping out in the street, who of us wouldn't agree to any terms in order to avoid that fate? In exchange for a mere piece of bread, a starving person will agree to work for a year. If you demand a decade, they would agree to that too. If you demand they also turn over their children, they will. Vulnerability is having to say yes to whatever offer you are given. And here we have our Torah to say that there are limits. You could extract anything and everything from a vulnerable person, but you can't. Not because it isn't possible, but because it isn't right. And we belong to a tradition that says that might is not right. Our actions matter. You do not take advantage of those that are vulnerable, even if you can get away with it. These are prescriptive aspirations for how our world should look. A world that is fair, a world that is just. A world where success in life is not predicated merely on luck. But that is not really what I want to talk about tonight. For those that have had a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah, you are familiar with the term haftarah. Haftarah, based on the Hebrew word for addition, is a reading from the book of prophets meant to be read alongside the week's Torah portion. The haftarot are not random. Each week is meant to in some way supplement the Torah that it accompanies. This week, we read from the prophet Jeremiah. And to set the context, the reading, this takes place on the eve of the first exile by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Allow me to read the opening lines from this week's Haftarah portion. The word came to Jeremiah from Adonai after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to proclaim a release among them, that everyone should set free their Hebrew slaves, both male and female, and that no one should keep a fellow Judean enslaved. Everyone, officials and people who had entered into the covenant, agreed to set their male and female slaves free and not keep them enslaved any longer. They complied, and they let them go. The opening of our Haftarah, it is not aspirational. It is not prescriptive. It is not talking about what should happen. It is descriptive, talking about what is actually happening. And it isn't pretty. If there is, as we know in the Torah, already a law about releasing the enslaved, why hasn't that happened? And if you're trying to come up with the answer saying, well, I bet it's just a reminder that it's year 7 and that they were going to do it anyway and everyone was somehow on the exact same calendar. If that's what you were thinking, well, the text goes on to clarify. Thus said Adonai, the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your ancestors when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, and I said to them, in the 7th year, each of you must let go any fellow Hebrew who may be sold to you. When he has served you 6 years, you must set him free. But your ancestors would not obey me or give me ear. It gets worse. As the prophet Jeremiah describes, the enslaved were set free, but not because it was the right thing to do. It was because Israel was on the cusp of exile, but it did not yet know how that story was going to end. All the Israelites knew was that King Nebuchadnezzar was on his way, and they needed to get right with God before the battle. So they decided to follow God's rules. They set their slaves free not because it was right and not because it was the law, but because they thought doing it would benefit them. It gets worse. After they released everyone, Nebuchadnezzar got distracted and started a fight with Egypt. The danger for the Israelites had passed. So what did they do? As Jeremiah teaches, "But now you have turned back and have profaned my name. Each of you has brought back the men and the women whom you had given their freedom and forced them to be your slaves again." To summarize, the Israelites ignored the law. In a moment of desperation, they decided to follow it. And when that desperation stopped, when the danger passed, they re-enslaved everyone, despite by that point knowing exactly what the law was and knowing they were in undeniable defiance of it. I began tonight by asking what you love about Judaism. For me, it is this. Let me explain. Of course, I do not love the behavior described in the Haftarah. It is abhorrent. What I love is that this account survived. For anyone who has gotten a new computer or a new phone, you know it's not easy to preserve everything. All the more so in the ancient world, these texts needed to be copied by professional scribes by hand. They needed to be stored. They needed to be protected, not just by the generation that produced them, but by their children and their children's children. And somehow, this text that describes an abhorrent moral failure, an indefensible embarrassment to the generation that it describes, was preserved. And somehow, when the rabbis were assigning Haftarot and came to the Torah portion that describes the necessity of treating the vulnerable with dignity and holiness, they paired that Torah portion with a reading of Israel doing the exact opposite. What is it that I love about Judaism? That it has the courage to prescribe a vision and simultaneously describe a reality, even a shameful one. The Torah teaches us our behavior should matter. Our tradition is not afraid to remind us harshly when we fall short. That is the mark of a religion and a tradition that is at peace with itself. It is able to be self-reflective. It can say everyone is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and also say, these right here are the times when we forgot that. And when we forget our key teachings, we will remember our failures. Lofty words mean nothing without the courage and the insistence to hold up that mirror and ask, really ask, do we practice what we preach? Our Torah serves as a guide for ethical conduct. Ultimately, it is in our hands whether we read about what is right or if we will do what is right. Can you hear Ratzon? May it be God's will.